Very good evening to you all. When I say you all, those of you who are here, welcome. It's good that you're here. Tonight it's my pleasure to welcome you here as one of the ministers of St John's. My name's Alistair Lane, and I wanted to just thank you for being here. It's an opportunity for us to engage tonight in some theology and some politics. And I think your presence here, although we haven't got high numbers tonight, that's fine. Your presence here is indicative that tonight we're going to engage in some important issues, and I applaud you for that. I guess the relationship between faith and politics is one that many of us would identify as crucial as we face a world that is really struggling to find true justice, freedom and peace. And so politics, of course, with the power that comes with politics, has much influence in these areas. And although some may say that there's either any relationship between faith and politics is likely to corrupt the church or politicise the church, diverting the church from its true mission, I think that others of us will recognise that the real issue is not whether there is a link between faith and politics, but how do faith and politics link together? How are they understood? How are we to understand, as followers of Christ, how we should be actively interested and engaged in the political and indeed social and other issues, economic realities. So it's a recognition of this that the Centre for Theology and Public Issues, and indeed the church community here at St John's, offers tonight's forum. And we want to intentionally allow theology to guide and inform the political debate as we approach the general election later this month. So let me I want to just offer some thanks to folks. I want to thank the two Andrews, Andrew Bradstock and Andrew Shepherd, who's here tonight, for initiating this roadshow, for offering it to us, for organising tonight's speakers, tonight's summariser and tonight's chair. Also want to thank Ailsa Salt and her team for helping set up the venue tonight and offering the supper that we'll enjoy at half-time. And finally, just to thank you all also for being here and for finding the time to come and to be informed as we indeed build up to the general election. And I hope that this forum will be a helpful time to contemplate those issues which face us and our communities. So indeed, welcome, and I'll now pass over to Frank, who's going to introduce tonight's speakers for us.
Just a question, is that a microphone necessary to be used? Or?
Well, ideally, we are recording tonight, so, yep.
Well, good evening. So I'm Frank Nelson. I'm the Dean of Wellington Cathedral St Paul, and I've been asked to chair tonight's meeting, so I add my own words of welcome to you all. Alistair talked about the half-time, and I'm told that in Dunedin, when this series of lectures was given 2 nights ago, they used the rugby analogy, which is still presumably fresh in our minds, although I don't know if it's like you like me, but I got to the stage where I was thoroughly sick of it all, although still nail-biting stuff at the end. But basically we have 4 speakers doing 8 to 10 minutes each, which takes us to roughly 40 minutes, half-time, at which point Deborah Broom, who is sitting down here, Deborah is the canon theologian in the Anglican Diocese of Wellington, as well as being vicar of Northlands, and she will offer just a summary at the end of the 40 minutes to remind us of what has been said, and of course recognising that it's her perspective and her points that she's putting across to us. So our first speaker tonight then is Lisa Beech, who will be talking roughly around the area of alcohol, advertising, consumerism and its effects. And Lisa is a research and advocacy coordinator for Caritas Aotearoa New Zealand, a Catholic agency for justice, peace and development. She works on social issues of social justice in our country, rights for the Catholic and wider community, contributes to the drafting of statements for the New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Conference, and makes Caritas submissions to Parliament, so well experienced and certainly competent and capable. Her previous work experience includes work with beneficiaries, low-paid workers and state housing tenants. As an electorate secretary, professional orchestral and folk musician. And amongst all that other stuff, finds time to be mother of 3 and an active member of the Eucharistic community at Te Kāinga Catholic Marae in Kilburnie. Lisa, welcome tonight.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Greetings to you all. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. And thanks to the Otago University Centre for Theology and Public Issues for organising this meeting. Because I'm Catholic, I'm something of an expert in guilt, and so I want to start with a confession. I was under the impression I was asked to speak tonight on poverty and inequality. Andrew Bradstock persuaded me that these issues fitted well with their paper on alcohol and advertising, which I read while drinking a glass of wine, which just goes to prove that important decisions should not be made under the influence of alcohol. But I do want to admit too, I've been at the odd meeting over the last few years where different church representatives for whom alcohol law reform is a burning issue have thought it would be just great if Catholics would front the issue because we drink more than other Christians. I've heard that we're regarded as being a little over-enthusiastic about Jesus' first public miracle being about providing wine for a wedding, and that we've got a suspiciously good understanding of the AA's 12-point program and serenity prayer. And I'm sorry, I need to admit I haven't got a great knowledge of the current policy debates on alcohol reform, but I did discuss with the select committee that Catholic chaplains should be allowed to take communion wine into prisons. But what I can talk about is from first-hand knowledge is how in New Zealand's poorest suburbs, even though affordable food is rarely available within walking distance, there always seems to be easy, immediate access to 4 of the terrible scourges of poor communities: bottle stores, fast food outlets, pokie machines and loan sharks. There's plenty of places in New Zealand where it's much easier to buy beer than to buy a cauliflower. For myself, when I was living on a benefit and then working for wages that couldn't begin to cover my childcare costs, my mind-altering substance of choice, which was also the greatest temptation for people around me, was not so much alcohol as the instant gratification of hot chips. Like many of my neighbours, despite a totally inadequate food budget, we regularly committed that unspeakable crime of buying takeaway food on benefit day or wage day. Usually fish and chips, but without the fish. It's hard to describe the desperate longing to feel full just one day a week, or the soporific sense of comfort that follows overindulgence by hungry people of a large feed of potatoes, fat and salt. Such an acknowledgement, I know, runs the risk of justifying the arguments that the poor in New Zealand live impoverished lives, not because of totally inadequate benefits or wages, but because we make poor choices. One of the hardships the poor have to endure is the tut-tutting from the better-off suburbs over the consumer choices we make, and the lectures we're obliged to endure that of course we would all live in prosperity if we budgeted better, cooked healthy stews from dog bones, grew our own strawberries, darned our own socks, and made our raincoats from plastic rubbish bags. So while I was asked to speak about alcohol, advertising and consumerism, I want to beg your indulgence in turning our attention a little away from the purchasing choices of the poor to a brief look at our gaps in income and social well-being in a country which still prides itself on being egalitarian. Many New Zealanders have failed to notice that we're no longer an equal society because many of us do not move very much out of our comfort zones, and many assume that other people are living very much the same as they are. And when we advertise to the world we're a clean green country with great race relations and a classless society, which is a great place to bring up children, sometimes we fall for our own propaganda. There are facts which contradict that sense of being a fair and equal society. And there are also stories, and I'd like to share a few of both. Firstly, it's important to remember that New Zealand had the highest growth in inequality in the OECD between the mid-1980s and 2000. The growth in inequality resulted from economic and social policies introduced and followed by both major political parties. Secondly, many people don't realise that the negative consequences of income inequality are not just felt at the extremes. Between 1982 and 1998, 80% of New Zealanders experienced a fall in their income, while only the top 20% of New Zealanders experienced an increase. While this did level off a little in the past decade, the inequalities have now become entrenched. So the wealthiest 10% of the population now hold over 50% of New Zealand's wealth, while the bottom 50% of the population share only 5.2%. And what does this look like in practice? Here's a few snapshots from my experience. As well as working with beneficiaries and low-income families, for many years I supported this work by being a luxury item, playing string quartets at rich people's parties. So I've seen the champagne flowing at parties on the same day I've tried to help a family of 6 get a food and income grant, a work and income food grant, after a week living on boiled potatoes, and still having to race desperately to the food bank at the end of the day when it became clear that WINS wasn't going to help. And I've played at a private home where the spare bedroom allotted for the musician's gear was larger than the entire living space of a family of 14 living in a 2-bedroom flat, and then helped them to move into a 4-bedroom state house, only then to grieve as the newborn baby died unnecessarily of a respiratory infection in the cold, uninsulated, unheated home. And I've heard people complaining about the laziness of the poor while dropping crumbs from hors d'oeuvres on a carpet that would be cleaned at 4 a.m. the following morning by a cleaner whose shifts mean that she is never at home when her children are awake. There's much more that I could say, but behind the political rhetoric about cutting down tall poppies and hampering wealth creation, we have a deeply and increasingly divided society. And the worst of it is that there are New Zealanders who not only have no idea, but cannot imagine how others live. Our religious tradition calls us to a very different way of seeing our neighbours. Our biblical tradition shows that concern for the poorest members of society was a constant message of the prophets. In the Gospels, we see clearly Christ's compassion for the poor. As Christians, we look out for the good of our neighbours, not just what suits us best. We do this not just because it's better for them, but because a fair society is better for everyone. Bringing this back for a moment to my given topic, alcohol is actually only one of the many substances which blunts our perception of reality and breaks down our relationships. They affect our sense of responsibility for ourselves and for each other. It is true, people under the influence of alcohol may behave violently and carelessly towards people they love. It is true that some people under the influence of cannabis become dull and lethargic. It is true that some people under the influence of advertising believe that they're entitled to things that they have been told over and over again are essential to be a cool person. But it's also true that some people under the influence of cocktail parties become immune to the desperation of people with empty cupboards. And it's also true that some people under the influence of expensive cars forget what it's like to wait in the rain for a bus. And some people, under the influence of air conditioning and central heating, lose any sense of what it means to depend on our climate and our environment for our survival. And some people, under the influence of individualism, lose a sense of solidarity with the most poor and vulnerable members of society. In their election statement, the New Zealand Catholic bishops ask us to use our vote as an ethical and moral decision. Our Catholic tradition gives priority to human life and dignity, to the preferential protection of the poor and vulnerable, to the common good of all, and to our responsibility as stewards of God's creation. Above all, they ask us to think about what election choices are not what election choices are better for me, but what election choices are better for us. So let's think about it. But I advise you to drink water while you do it. Because, as I said before, important decisions shouldn't be made under the influence of alcohol. Make them instead under the influence of love. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. What I didn't say in my welcoming you all was that the second half will be open to questions to the panellists, so we won't take questions now, but after we've had a cup of tea without alcohol. I don't know when this carpet is cleaned. Anyway, our second speaker tonight is Andrew Shepherd, originally from Wellington, Titahi Bay, Mana College, graduate here from Victoria University, and postgraduate degrees in theology and exploring ethics, Christian ethic of hospitality at Otago University. He's spent much of his working life involved in both formal and informal Christian education. Previously worked with the Tertiary Students Christian Fellowship, the Bible College of New Zealand, now Laidlaw College, the Youth Training Organisation Praxis, and working freelance now as teacher, researcher in various tertiary training institutions. And presently, I think you're in Otago, based at Otago, working alongside Andrew Bradstock as Associate Research Fellow at the Centre for Theology and Public Issues. There's a sort of common theme here that he also has 3 children and enjoys climbing mountains, among other things. Anyway, we look forward, Andrew, to hearing you talk about our national identity and perhaps something on the treaty. Andrew.
Tēnā koutou, thank you, Frank, for your welcome, and thank you for turning out on a Thursday night. If this had been a couple of weeks ago, then you would have been, I'm sure, sitting at home watching rugby rather than being here. And indeed, for the last 2 months, we have been inundated by rugby, saturated with it somewhat, such that we seem to have almost forgotten that there's an upcoming general election. But I can guarantee you that in the coming weeks, as we move towards the election, issues around identity, questions of race relations, immigration will come to the fore. I can guarantee this. And tonight my brief was to talk about questions of identity and the Treaty of Waitangi. But my problem is that if I jump directly to this, a lot of you will still be thinking about rugby. And so instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to provide some transition from the Rugby World Cup to help us think through these issues as we come towards a general election. In contrast to the declaration, sports and politics don't mix, I want to suggest that a retrospective reflection on the Rugby World Cup may well tell us something about our identity as New Zealanders, and also offer some insights into what I think will be some of the core issues that we will need to ponder in the exercise of democracy. So what might a deeper reflection on the Rugby World Cup say to us about questions of identity? I want to make 5 brief reflections on race relations, immigration, aid, migration and representation. My first point is around the question of race relations and a question of partnership. Before I began, I was talking to someone, and one of the obvious absences in the political leaders' debate, Gough and Key the other night, was that there was no mention at all of Māori. And one could say, well, they were discussing questions of economics and questions of the environment. But nevertheless, bearing in mind that the country Aotearoa that we live in, this was a notable absence. In contrast, during the Rugby World Cup, we witnessed the multicultural composition of the All Blacks. Our representatives, Māori, Samoan, Pākehā, Croatian, and while this time there were no great Tongan or Fijian wingers such as Jonah Lomu, Doug Howlett or Sitiveni Sivivatu, nevertheless, in the future I'm sure they will be back. Something of this multicultural element of the All Blacks has been embraced in their new haka, kapa o panga, which both draws on their history of the 1924 All Black haka, but also blends other Polynesian styles. And it seems to me that this affirming and embracing of our cultural diversity is an important expression of our treaty partnership, a recognition of our diversity in this country. But this raises questions for me. What is the depth of this partnership? You see, despite our pride in the All Blacks and our embracing of the haka, is Māoridom, is Māori culture simply part of our rugby culture? Helpful as an image perhaps for promoting tourism? What does genuine political economic partnership look like? What would it mean for our legislation, government structures, health and education systems to really embrace an understanding of partnership? For example, the broadcasting of the Rugby World Cup on Māori television. Te Reo was broadcast throughout the world. But what if, rather than just during the Rugby World Cup or during the 1 week of Māori Language Week, we actually had Te Reo regularly heard on primetime news? If we really are proud of Te Reo as one of our 3 official languages, is there any good reason why we don't make it a compulsory part of our educational curriculum? Piriwipu from Wainuiomata, Dan Carter from North Canterbury, and their pivotal positions seem to work seamlessly together despite their differences. And indeed, there are creative ways of recognising our differences while allowing people to play to their strengths and keeping the team on track. How do we apply this to our broader society? What might partnership look like in other institutions? Does the partnership between Māori and the Crown necessarily preclude the establishment of distinct Māori institutions? Can we, for instance, affirm one law for all and still have the flexibility of court proceedings taking place on a marae? My second point, hospitality. Questions here of immigration. During the World Cup, much was made of the fact that we were hosting the world. And while we successfully hosted 95,000 visitors, what of our welcome to those who seek to come to our shores for longer periods? We're particularly welcoming of burly, coordinated Polynesians who have particular skills and talents with an oval ball. But is our offering of welcome to others as open-armed? Currently, the government sets an annual quota of 45,000 per year immigrants, plus or minus 5,000. And each year we take 1,250 refugees through the mandated UNHCR quota refugee program. What do we think about immigration? Should we be seeking to increase immigration with its resulting economic growth? Or do we want to stay a small nation, 4 million people in the grandstand? And if we do want immigration, which immigrants should we seek to entice? Those who stayed abreast of the Rugby World Cup and the personal interest stories may remember the story of 21-year-old Daryl Sabin. Sabin suffered a serious head injury in 2009 from playing rugby, but he has become, according to Graham Henry, the 31st member of the All Black squad, attending trainings, sitting with non-playing members of the team in the grandstand, and sometimes even on the bench. While clearly Sabin will never play for the All Blacks, both McCaw and Henry have welcomed him into their broader All Blacks scene and see him as an important part of their culture. What if we were to take this attitude beyond the rugby field? Do we likewise have a responsibility of accepting those who are affected and injured by their participation in the harsh realities of the world? Do we only welcome skilled or well-moneyed immigrants, Or what about the refugees of the world affected by the consequences of our profligate Western standard of living and who seek to establish new lives? Do we have a moral obligation to welcome those from parts of the world racked by war and environmental crisis, even if they won't necessarily play a leading role on the field? How hospitable are we really as a country? My third point, overseas aid. What might it mean for us to love our nearest neighbour? See, again, we're happy to pick the best of the best rugby talent from our Polynesian neighbours and develop them for our on-field advantage. But do we give our best in return? The New Zealand aid budget for 2010-2011 is $525 million. Samoa, for instance, receives $23 million of this. And this may sound like a lot of money, but it's worth reflecting that the government spent $300 million and local government spent $300 million on cup-related projects. And the tournament deficit of $39 million after ticket sales was paid out, spread between the government for $26 million and the NZRFU for $13 million. $525 million accounts for 0.26 of GDP, and yet at the UN General Assembly in 1970, New Zealand, like other donor countries, promised to up our spending to 0.7%. Except for a brief period under the Norman Kirk government of the 1970s, New Zealand's aid assistance has rarely been over 0.3% of GDP. My fourth point, migration and the brain drain. You see, another notable feature of the World Cup was our pride in the fact that as well as this All Black squad of 30, which became 32, and Sabin 33, as well as these players, there were 40 other players who hailed from New Zealand and 4 other coaches involved in other teams. But isn't this a brain drain? See, how is it that we can show so much pride in the exporting of our rugby skills and gifts to the world, yet complain so bitterly about the fact that there are 600,000 New Zealanders who identify themselves with this country yet living elsewhere? Or the fact that 45,000 New Zealanders leave each year on a permanent long-term basis? Perhaps, rather than being seen negatively, shouldn't we embrace this as an important part of our identity as New Zealanders, to recognise our sojourning tendencies? Like our rugby export, shouldn't it be celebrated that many of our brightest and best head overseas for parts of their career and return with greater skills and experience? Would Graham Henry have been the most successful coach in All Black history without his experience of coaching in Wales or with the British Lions? And to my final point, representation. You see, finally, one of the things we've learnt about the Rugby World Cup is the merits of team leadership. Henry, Hansen and Smith, we've decided, are much better than John Mitchell by himself. But what might it mean for us to develop a team with different personalities and perspectives if they do indeed yield better results? Why don't we take a more collaborative approach to the way we do politics? Why, even after over a decade on MMP, does politics seem to still take an adversarial approach rather than the pooling of collective wisdom? And why this fascination with first past the post? You see, like old bring back buck signs, there seems to be this continuing fascination, a romantic nostalgia for the past. I want to suggest to you that professional rugby is far faster and a more physical game than when Buck Shelford played. And likewise, first past the post would undoubtedly look out of place in our contemporary religious, ethnically and culturally diverse society. To conclude, the Rugby World Cup has been an amazing experience for New Zealand. There has been a sense of solidarity and great pride. I'm sure you will account for even amongst the non-rugby watchers in New Zealand who have been caught up in the atmosphere. But what are the challenges that we face in the future beyond the Rugby World Cup? The rebuilding of Christchurch, global climate change and ecological challenges that will confront us here in New Zealand, the continuing impact of global recession, our desire, as Lisa has commented, to build a more equitable society. These realities in the future seem to me to be much harder questions and greater challenges than running a 6-week tournament. How are we going to respond specifically to questions of race relations, immigration, aid, immigration and representation? Questions which I think are critical as we move forward. Could it be that the church, seeking to embody through its own life its belief in a God of partnership, hospitality, compassion, one who calls us to sojourn and work collaboratively together despite our differences? Could it be that the church has an important role in articulating and enacting a vision of what such a society may look like as we face these challenges in the future ahead? Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. It's interesting how, as one listens to a conversation, you inevitably pick out what appeals to you, and I find myself looking down the CVs that people have given to me, looking for the three. Now, Susan, you sort of break it when it comes to children, because Susan Blaikie, our next speaker, lives in a blended family, but you do have three, because you have 3 cats. So well done. Susan is a Wellingtonian here, spent much of her life in leadership and management roles. About 10, 11 years ago, was ordained as an Anglican priest, and for the past few years has been at the church in Wellington South. Just a few months ago, Susan was appointed city missioner for the Wellington City Mission, and among her passions are that of cultivating teams and vision, strategy and culture to enable people, this is a big phrase, to efficaciously respond to the kingdom of God. I love that. Brilliant. One of those perpetual students, and also finding joy in bringing Christ to those whose lives are often deprived of hope, joy, fullness or freedom. Susan, you're going to speak to us on families and relationships. Welcome, Susan, please.
Tēnā koutou katoa. This is my little wee one. So we have Courtney, who lives with us, and Hannah has been living with us since she was born, actually. So she's another part of our family. And here she comes. I think I might need some help, Mum or Dad. So I visited, for me, as Frank said, I became the city missioner a few months ago. Thank you, my dear. See you later, Gator. And I visited a wonderful family, and it consisted of a solo mother and her 2 little boys. So one of them was about 8 years old, and the other one was about 8 months old. And it was an insight for me as to the kind of journey that she had been on. So this one was still in her 20s, and yet she had gone through SIF, she had gone through divorce, she was illiterate, she had been physically, sexually and emotionally abused, and she had finally moved into a house where for the first time she said she had the sun coming through the window. And she's just in her 20s. And I must admit that when I left her that morning, I felt really buggered, just exhausted. One, because I'm not as young as I used to be. I can assure you that my hair has dyed. Secondly, because I think that there's a theological exhaustion to it, as it were. Because if she is tired, I am tired. For we all share a communal identity. One of my favourite theologians, Miroslav Volf, he's a theologian from Croatia. When he says that we become Christians, he said that we essentially become communal beings. You no longer belong to yourself. You belong to others as well. And so therefore, her pain is my pain. John Donne echoes it at the same time, doesn't he, a few centuries back? No man is an island. Even if a clod is washed away from the continent of Europe, it's still less of the continent. And that wonderful line, one death diminishes me, for I am involved in the human family. And that's true for us. that every family, every being in New Zealand that we are involved in. So therefore, family violence, for an example, that occurred in 44,620 families recorded by the New Zealand Police in 2008, is violence that is done to us as well. We too share in the hopelessness and the fear of 74,785 children who were present during those incidents. We share in the sinful hiddenness that probably the stats that I've just quoted to you, they believe, only represent 1/5 of the total statistics of violence in families in New Zealand. We share in the stigmatism that New Zealand has the third highest rate per capita of deaths of children through maltreatment in the OECD. We share in the fact that we have the highest teenage suicide rate for 15 to 19-year-olds. We share in the erosion of family stability and the decline of marriage and the increase of divorce and separations. And with that comes what I experienced in that morning, the incredible overwhelmingness, the isolation of being a solo parent, which I've been, which now represents 29% of our families, and they expect in the next 3 years it will go to 1/3 of our families will be solo parent-led. And by the way, in solo parent-led families, that is where our poorest children are. 270,000 children live in relative poverty in New Zealand, of which 170,000 of them are well below the line of poverty, according to the Child Poverty Action Group latest report, Further Left Behind. This is our poverty. This is our selfish capitalism that the top 10% of wealthy individuals in New Zealand own 51% of our net worth. Our top 1% own 16.4%. Professor Ruth Lister, she's the UK Director of the Child Poverty Action Group, she said this in 2010: "A society that condones poverty in its midst is not a fair or an inclusive society. So long as a significant minority is unable to participate fully in the life of the community, enjoy the kind of living standards taken for granted by the majority because of inadequate material resources, poverty eradication has to be our primary goal. Poverty excludes. It undermines the life chances of children and young people." So with that sharing that we share, what might a healthy family look like? One blessed by God, one that God has in her mind. We might want a full and flourishing family. Now, what I think it's not, or it's certainly not narrowed to, is a snapshot of the nuclear family of mum and dad and the 2.5 kids in a white picket fence. Nuclear families are actually quite a modern invention, and as with some of the stats that I've shown you, they're literally blowing apart into sub-nuclear components. So what might a healthy family look like? What might we want? What might our election and our government strive for? Well, I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all, but I want to share with you what I think might be 5 key ingredients in the cake of family, to use a very poor metaphor. So the first one is, for me, is I think families thrive in an environment where parents and caregivers and all those who have a major investment in the child or children remain in loving and stable relationships. And I mean the costly sense of the word love. As in, I'll be with you when you're sick, when you're old, when you're unwell, or when we're poor. Richard Layard, who's a British economist, wrote that stable relationships remain the single highest promoter of well-being. So marriage, for me, and probably for the church, remains one of the best communal commitments to loving one another beyond that loss. But equally, however, I've seen the most incredible de facto couples and amazing solo parents who also equally bear that load incredibly beautifully and lovingly. Secondly, families thrive in communities that intentionally strive for income equality, and this has been touched on already. When the gap between the richest and the poor is reduced, You reduce stigmatism, separation, disinterest or apathy, particularly for those in poverty. When Paula Bennett announced her new benefit restructure, I read some of the comments on Stuff, and it was frightening, the comments. It was just like, great, let's get these dull bludgers out. And there was just so many of the comments that echoed the kind of dehumanisation and that stigmatism for being on a benefit. The third point, families thrive in villages. Christianity and its purient religion, Judaism, are just huge on communal identity and sharing. One of the biggest issues that I dislike about the nuclear family is that it hides, it's hidden behind walls. But in villages, you've got something that breaks apart and is exposed. And in that exposure comes sharing. It becomes an opportunity for feedback, for wealth. I mean, one thing that I do love, and I just celebrate, for an example, on ethics, is I love that it's not okay to be violent campaigns. But I find it quite depressing that the most common voice for this kind of ethics is coming through the television. Because if violence occurs in a house, a television isn't going to do much about it. But if a village is there, they can intervene in dialogue and take part. The fourth point, families thrive with an income that enables them to live in houses that are dry and warm and healthy. And believe you me, we have plenty of houses since I've become the Missioner that are far from warm or dry. I had no idea before I took up this role that you can move into a housing corp home that has no curtains, no carpets, no insulation. And you've got to provide for it. So we've seen families in those situations in winter living in the lounge because they can't afford to heat the bedrooms. So we want to see incomes in families where they can have houses that are warm and dry, where they can maintain the costs of something like electricity even in the winter so they don't have to get a high interest loan to pay for it. Incomes that enable them to buy nutritious food, obtain medical care, eat fresh fruit and vegetables, and have access to all levels of education. Not over-the-top income to meet what we hope to be the well-being, promote the well-being of families. And finally, families thrive when they have influence and a voice. Now, when at the City Mission we go and see a family, the first thing that we do is we just listen. Families have voices. Children have voices. Those who are oppressed by violence or the threat of violence have voices. One of the first and most faithful acts of our work, and indeed of Christians, is to create a public space where those who are often voiceless have their say. So, is the well-being of families worth our time and investment? Well, of course, I think that it is. Because when families are at their best, not only can they be amazing for those immediate dependencies, whether it be children or parents, I have my mother who lives with me, but they can be amazing salt, light and leaven to their community. I know of families that just between just a few of them, and a couple of them are here today, can transform a community like the Newtown Park Flats. I know of communities, a family, where they take in prisoners straight from Rimataka and they take them in and they transform their lives because they've opened up their family. That's how good families can be. So I encourage you during this election to think strategically about what promotes family well-being, what policies give voice to the most vulnerable, who is addressing our growing inequality in income, who is enabling and fostering community involvement, who is actively addressing the 160,000 children who live well below the poverty line. And because remember that when we give them this voice, when we do this for the least, we do it for Christ. Therefore, we do it for ourselves and we do it for each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Some common themes beginning to come through very clearly. So our next and final speaker tonight, before Deborah gives a sort of summing up, is Glyn Carpenter. And to my relief, Glyn has 3 children. Sorry, Glyn. And Glyn has spent much of his life in software development and management, but also in counselling and theology. He is currently National Director of the New Zealand Christian Network and the New Zealand member of the World Evangelical Alliance. Has served on a number of national committees and boards, including Resolve Christian Peacemaking, Christian Sports Network, Rethinking Crime and Punishment, and Love Your Neighbour. Among Glyn's life goals are to help people know God and to enjoy God in their professional and private lives. He is an elder in the church in Northcote in Auckland, where he has served in the training centre and as a deacon. Glyn, we welcome you as you come to speak to us on the topic of crime and punishment. Thank you, Glyn.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to begin just by acknowledging one of my board members who snuck into the room. She's not Wellington-based, so I'm very surprised to see her here, and her Janet Tuck over here, and her husband Dean. So thanks for coming along. My topic this evening is different from the one I had in Dunedin on Tuesday night, but it's crime and justice. And I guess I wouldn't be starting off by telling you anything you don't know when I say that attitudes in the criminal justice system and the debate have become increasingly harsh in recent years. Slogans like "Get Tough on Crime" and groups like Sensible Sentencing Trust have captured popular thinking and succeeded in bringing about a range of tougher measures, including the recent 3 strikes legislation. As a member of the Rethinking Crime and Punishment group for the past 5 or 6 years, a group which includes church representatives, Christian academics from theology and law, practising lawyers, a retired judge, and even a think tank that some describe as right-wing, I can assure you that we are all dismayed at the direction the debate is going at present. These talks are all based around resource papers, and I commend them to you, developed from the Centre of Theology and Public Issues. They're a great resource to stimulate thinking and discussion in your families and churches. In fact, that each of the topics you've heard tonight is 2 papers. One is a detailed paper of about 15 to 20 pages. The other one is a summary for those of you who haven't got time to read the 15 pages. There's a 1-page summary and 1 page of questions, and they're great to take back to your churches. The crime and punishment paper covers 7 broad topics, and I'll touch on each of these briefly. Firstly, the purpose of a criminal justice system. A healthy justice system should protect society from those who represent a danger. It should also help prepare people to re-enter society and to make a positive contribution. The paper talks about restitution, redemption, reconciliation and forgiveness, words which should seem basic to a Christian, yet are conspicuously absent from the current debate. Secondly, it touches on high rates of imprisonment in New Zealand and the cost and the effectiveness. New Zealand's rate of imprisonment at 200 per 100,000 is one of the highest in the Western world, well ahead of Australia at 133, or even the countries with the highest figures in Europe, England and Wales, on 154. New Zealand's rate increased by 65% in the decade up to 2005, and at $93,000 on average to keep one prisoner in jail for 1 year, the cost factor alone should be enough to cause us to reconsider the rate at which we're locking people up. Thirdly, it touches on what does the Bible say. The paper gives a number of examples of how justice issues are addressed in Scripture, which indicate a very different emphasis to that promoted in the Get Tough mantra. The paper says that prisons never receive any divine endorsement in Scripture, and that God's particular interest seems to be on setting prisoners free. This reveals a theme in the paper, shared by Rethinking Crime and Punishment, that locking people up in prison has become something of an obsession recently, and an expensive one at that. Caring for prisoners as well as their victims is one of the hallmarks of a Christian, as Jesus highlighted in the story of the sheep and the goats. And quoting directly from the paper, it says, in the Old Testament, criminal actions were thought to reflect a deficiency in the whole community, not just the individual concerned. And therefore the community itself was called to repent and turn to God. Seeking restitution was thought to be good for the victim, the offender, and for the wider community. One lesson that these scriptures might have for us today is that real change to people's behaviour comes less through their being punished in a spirit of retribution than by being given the opportunity to reflect upon their consequences of their actions, make restitution, and seek forgiveness from and reconciliation with those that they've wronged. This reflects the core message of the Christian gospel, that God does not want to punish us for the sins that we've committed, but calls us to repentance and offers us forgiveness. Fourth point it touches on is the purpose of imprisonment and what sort of people are in prison. Central to our thinking on this issue is what we see as the purpose of punishment and imprisonment. Is it only to punish, or is it also to provide a chance for people to change? If it is the latter, then we will want to look at what sort of people we are locking up and why. The statistics show that the vast majority of people in our prisons are men of Maori or European ethnicity, aged between 20 and 35. Nearly 75% have no educational qualification above year 11. More than half have mental illness or personality disorder or have drug or alcohol addictions. Is prison really the best place for people with major depressive disorders, bipolar disorders, psychotic illnesses and other mental illnesses? Is it the best place for people with a dependency on drugs and alcohol? Literally thousands of studies have been done showing that punishment is ineffective in changing human behaviour and that imprisoning more people has minimal effect on the crime rate. The fifth point in the paper addresses alternatives to prison, asks whether greater use could be made of alternative methods of punishment such as fines, conditional or deferred sentences and community service. And this is particularly relevant for young people who've committed relatively minor offences, since as well as potentially damaging them psychologically, it can expose them to what you might call unhelpful influences if they're locked up inside. Sixth point the paper addresses is support for victims. One of the criticisms that's been levelled at the group that I'm involved with, Rethinking Crime Punishment, has been that it does not care about victims. This has never been true. But it is true that many of the group's statements have not specifically addressed this issue, and so we can see why that perception might exist. Rethinking strongly supports victim support. It's a voluntary organisation which assists victims of crimes and their families. Rethinking also endorses the idea of restorative justice. Should acknowledge Chris Marshall here tonight. Although these can be difficult experiences, numerous accounts suggest that such encounters can have positive results for both victim and offender. In contrast to a focus on retribution alone, which may actually hinder victims from finding a healthy resolution to the offence. Finally, the paper calls for a change of attitude. It calls for a change in the way that we look at crime and those who commit it. Because our natural inclination is for revenge, it accepts that this will require a massive shift in our thinking. Yet, if offenders are released back into the community without having benefited from training or rehabilitation programs aimed at reducing their potential to re-offend, and if the deeper factors which lead people to commit criminal offences in the first place are not addressed, we will not be any safer as a society. Thank you.
Just time now to take a few minutes to invite Deborah to come forward and to give her brief summary and perhaps focus some of what has been said. And then after that we'll have a break for some supper and then come back in a time for questions from the floor. Deb.
I should perhaps point out I have 2 children, but I do have 3 cats. I also have 2 guinea pigs and a dog. So I'm not sure what that says about me, but
3 squares, a village.
Something like that. Yeah, it is indeed a village. Apart from my husband, everything else in the household is female. He deserves some sympathy. We've heard an amazing number of contributions tonight, and I just thought I'd recap where we've got to some of the main points that each of the speakers have given to us and some of the questions it raises in my mind. And I suspect that as we've been going through, other questions may well have popped into your minds. Lisa told us about the ease of access in New Zealand's poorest suburbs to bottle stores, fast food outlets, pokie machines and loan sharks. And I guess that says something about market supply and demand and the reasons behind companies choosing where to site their outlets. But she told us also that purchasing choices of the poor are not the only or even the most important issue. And I guess that says something about what consumerism looks like and what advertising tends to target can appear very different depending on where you are. Lisa makes a very good point where she says that we assume that most other people are living very much as we are, except that that assumption is wrong, and we all need to broaden our ideas about what society looks like. New Zealand is an increasingly unequal society, and books like The Spirit Level tell us how bad that is for everybody. And then Lisa makes a plea for us to remember the words of the biblical prophets and for us all to open our eyes and see the lives that our brothers and sisters are living and make our voting choices on what is better, not for me, but for all of us. The question that came to me, though, is to what extent are our responses to advertising or to some types of purchases and to alcohol determined by unspoken assumptions about social class and economic power? You know, it's okay to eat and drink a lot at a fine dining restaurant, but not to buy fast food or flagons of beer. And if that's so, how do we challenge those assumptions? And many of the dangers, I think, inherent in things like excessive drinking and consumerism, what might be termed excessive purchasing, lay in the extent to which we use things like alcohol and consumer goods to numb ourselves from parts of life we don't want to face. You know, it's not called retail therapy for nothing. So what are we to do about this? And what role might the churches have in modelling a different approach? And Andrew had the delightful idea of taking our recent preoccupation with the rugby to offer some reflections about national identity. And doesn't that in itself, the putting of identity and rugby in the same sentence, suggest something about New Zealand? And not everybody might agree with that centrality of our identity. He talked about the multiracial All Blacks and raised some questions about how equal the partnership between different races actually is in New Zealand, and whether this is a core part of national identity or simply a good tourism poster. How does partnership and separateness go together? We had an interesting discussion of hospitality and immigration. It's okay to welcome people as tourists who come to spend their money here, but New Zealand has different criteria for those who want to move here permanently, particularly those who may not have lots of money. And I read somewhere the other week that was actually critical of how few refugees we actually admit. We have a relatively small quota, but we actually admit even fewer than the quota. And the issues of overseas aid, of official development assistance, and the incredibly small percentage of GDP that New Zealand actually gives. Andrew made us think about the inconsistency of our reactions to the New Zealand diaspora. It's good when it comes to exporting our rugby players, but bad when it comes to other sorts of skills. And representation and the merits of team leadership, trying to get a more collaborative and less adversarial approach to politics. It made me wonder, where do biblical values about the care for aliens, for non-citizens, come into our national identity? What does it mean, really, when New Zealand gets called God's own? What does our national anthem, God Defend New Zealand, actually say? And at the end, Andrew mentions other challenges like the impact of the global recession and the rebuilding of Christchurch. What might those things say about the relationship between the treaty and national identity? It made me wonder, how does the treaty partnership affect the rebuilding of Christchurch? should local tangata whenua have more of a role down there? And then Susan highlighted for us some of the concerns about families and relationships, some of our responses and some of our responsibilities for what affects one person affects us all, or at least it should affect us all. She asked some searching questions about what sort of family God would want for us, about the importance of stable relationships, of communities, of equal societies, and again the dangers of increasingly unequal societies, such as New Zealand is becoming. The importance of listening to the voices of families and of children, of those who so easily can be silenced, and the role of families not just as recipients of care, but as agents of change. And Susan made a plea that when we make our voting choices, to ask about the policies that would benefit all of us, and especially those who are most vulnerable. So some questions. How can we as individuals and as members of churches foster community? Especially when we also maybe some of those who have little time to invest in community, how can we make this a real priority? How can we give more of a voice to those who lack it? What are some concrete steps that we might take to create that public space in which other voices are heard? And then lastly, Glyn gave us some useful comments on the purpose of the criminal justice system, the protection of society and the rehabilitation of offenders, and underlined some of the financial costs of the high rates of imprisonment that we have here, the ways in which the system is not working. He reminded us that God's interest, which we find in the Bible, is in setting prisoners free. Some interesting insights into who is in prison and why. I remember while I was at seminary, I did my CPE in Mount Eden Prison, and we were sitting there in our CPE group, which for that time was held at North Shore Hospital, and I was sitting in the cafeteria and wondered why it was strange, and I realised that the people in the cafeteria in North Shore Hospital were all Pākehā, and that wasn't the same as the prison population. And the insights that more than half of those in prison have a mental illness or personality disorders or drug or alcohol issues. Another one I remember is many of them have massive literacy problems. So how do we get through to people for whom reading is not something they do? But the questions like that, given the composition, given who is in prison and why, how do we find and fund alternatives to prison for that same group of people, especially since their ability to respond to things like fines or community service alternatives are affected by the same conditions which led to their imprisonment in the first place? What about the community emphasis on Scripture? The fact that so often in Scripture the community as a whole was called to repent. So what are we as a whole being called to repent, and how should we be doing this? So thank you to all of you for some of the things you've brought out for us, and that's some of the questions, and I guess everybody's got their own questions and we get a chance to work them out over a cup of tea.
Thank you, Deborah, for those reflections and insights. So let's have a time to wander around, break. I think there's coffee and tea served through there, and a chance to speak to each other. And it's 8:10, 10, 15 minutes we'll come back, and the plan is that by 9 o'clock we're done, and take these questions and thoughts back into our communities. Enjoy a short break.